Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Overrun Podcast. My name is Ed Bauter.
I'm Dan Schwester.
And today we have a special episode. We've brought on Matthew Hartnett, who is an attorney in the city of Philadelphia and in South Jersey in our area. Go Birds. And we wanted to bring you on, Matt, to have what I think is a pretty important discussion. We wanted to talk about how EMS professionals might interact with ICE agents now that we have all these new policies that are out. We thought it might be very confusing for first responders, EMTs, and even the police in some instances. So we wanted to talk to someone who had some expertise in it, and this is your background, this is your thing, and it helps that you're from the area that we're in as well, because this will apply directly to people that we talk to. So we just want to kind of dive right into it. So I guess when EMS workers go onto a call, what are the rights that EMS workers have? What are the patient's rights? And what I guess, how do we best protect ourselves if we do have an interaction with immigration and customs enforcement?
Sure. So, I think I thank you for the introduction. Thanks for having me. One of the things that we've been seeing sort of on the ground is that the question of what really constitutes a public versus a private space is sort of up in the air. And so the most quintessential or the most, traditional private space that we all have is our own home. And so certainly people have a right to privacy under the Fourth Amendment in their homes. But that right to privacy doesn't extend. So that means that police or whoever, ICE, cannot enter somebody's home without a judicial warrant. We'll talk about the difference between judicial and administrative warrants. It's a warrant signed by a judge for reasonable cause. So, one of the things that's important to know is that sort of reasonable expectation of privacy that we all have in our homes, that nobody can come into our home without our permission or without a warrant, does not extend to all public space. So that's where it becomes a little bit tricky, but it does extend to some spaces that are maybe sort of have a private and public component to them. And so, I was actually, when you guys reached out, it made me think about a situation where somebody might be in an ambulance, right? So that's kind of a...
And that's part of the issue, right? Is typically when we go out on calls, and let's say it's a private residence, right? We'll go into a house, which is private, and then we have to remove the patient from the house, which is public. And then we get into the ambulance, which might be up in the air and up to interpretation. And then we have to go to the hospital, which again, now we're outside in public and then inside in private. And I think there's a lot of confusion that can happen. And,
Sure.
And Danny, I know that your background is probably, I want to hear your ideas on this too, because with your law enforcement background, I'm sure you've thought about this as well, going out on jobs.
Yeah, but as a police officer, it was really kind of cut and dry. We generally didn't get involved with the EMS aspect of things unless we were actively doing patient care, like CPR or rescuing somebody, or the patient was in custody, in which case they're our responsibility. We got to ride with them. We've got to stay there to not only maintain the safety in the patient compartment, but we also have to make sure that the safety of the prisoner is in effect. People don't realize law enforcement has an affirmative duty to provide care to those that are in their custody. The courts have held that for a very long time. You see where that doesn't happen, where bad things happen. Generally, a first aid call is a first aid call to local cops once the person's in the ambulance. It's really not there. If they're not in custody, not something they're going to get involved with. But ICE is a little bit different because it's a federal agency. There is some federal laws that apply that don't necessarily apply to that. There's also constitutional issues here, all of which is way beyond the scope of your average EMT or paramedic. So, I guess my first question with Matthew is, can you tell us what ICE's jurisdiction is? What are their law enforcement powers? What can they do on a scene and what can't they do?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so it does start sort of where can they go, but let's say for the sake of argument that this is in public plain view. They certainly can't go just because. Actually, let me backtrack. Just because an EMS or an emergency medical worker might have permission to enter somebody's home without a warrant to provide emergency medical aid doesn't mean that an ICE officer can kind of hop on that train
and just piggyback into the house. So, there are exceptions, right, to that Fourth Amendment, even with a private residence, there are exceptions to that rule whether it's exigent circumstances, whether a person could be in danger or something, or a person could be really severely hurt, that you don't have to ask for that permission from the person who's in there, or you don't have to get a warrant. Really, their ability to enter private areas is very limited. And that goes to sort of this question as to, well,
these judicial versus administrative warrants. I mean, I've been doing this for over 15 years, and I've never seen a judicial warrant in the context of an ICE enforcement action. It's not to say they don't exist. I mean, they certainly most likely do exist if it's from maybe Homeland Security, investigate HSI, which is a part of the Department of Homeland Security that kind of works in conjunction with ICE, targeting whether it's employers or to be even investigating some type of fraud or terrorist stuff. But I've never seen it in the context of somebody being undocumented where they're taking an enforcement action against somebody where they have a judicial warrant. It's almost always an administrative warrant, and that administrative warrant is really just an internal document that the Department of Homeland Security uses to basically say, okay, we've identified somebody that we believe is in the United States unlawfully, or could be removed, or was at one point here lawfully, and could be removable. We're submitting this as notice. It's really notice under the Administrative Procedures Act. It's not. It doesn't go to that Fourth Amendment question where you're saying, okay, does this person have a right to? Is a person's privacy being infringed upon? That's sort of what I'm trying to say.
Right. And so I guess in this instance, if we're out in the field and we encounter these agents, there's professional lines that have to be maintained. I'm sure that, if you work for a hospital system or a municipality, there's certainly, various boundaries that people will have. But I guess what would be the best way to, I guess, to interface with an ICE agent and have a conversation while also trying to maintain the patient's privacy under HIPAA and also trying to maintain the best level of care we can?
Sure, certainly. Yeah, I do think it depends where the conversation occurs. I do think if there's an EMS worker that's in a private residence, I don't think that ICE can just use that, again, piggyback into the person's private residence. But let's say it's in plain view. Let's say somebody was hit by a car, and somebody responds. The most professional ways that a lot ICE enforcement, ICE officers are individuals. So, just on a personal level, trying to figure out where there must be something that they're looking for. There must be a target. Any type of enforcement action, there's usually a target, and then sometimes there are collateral arrests as to people that are around whoever the target was. So I typically tell clients they have contact with an ICE officer, just ask them what they're looking for, right? So let's say they're outside. Now, if they're at home and it's a knock on the door, it's a different conversation. It would be like, well, look, permission to come in, unless there's a judicial warrant, ask for it. And again, understand what would be the difference between the two. But I think, a common sense approach is usually what prevails. And that would be asking them, who are they looking for? What are they doing here? I've also counseled preschool about this, where there was some concern about ICE enforcement at a school, and I think in some level it's reminding them that there are certain spaces that it should be rare that ICE should be in that particular space. And I think any time when there's emergency medicine being applied would be a space that, absent really exigent circumstances, you really shouldn't be there, and just reminding them of that. And it's the same thing at a preschool. It's there are children here. What do you guys? Right. What do you guys looking for?
Where are we going with this guy?
Where are we going with this?
He's sick. We need to take care of him.
Where does this end? Yeah.
We really don't.
This guy's bleeding out.
Is that a good way to diffuse it? Just be I've always kind of anticipated my contacts with anybody, law enforcement or for that purpose is going to be, my first question is, are they under arrest?
Sure.
If they're not under arrest or in custody, you really don't have a lot to say. You also don't get to, as a law enforcement officer, tell me as a medical professional what's best right now. I get to make the choice on their best welfare because I'm the person who's in charge of that. Now, what they can do, like you said, if they have a warrant, that's a different story. You can ask to see the warrant. You can also tell them, as I've told officers and troopers in the past, guys, he's really sick. We got to go. This is where we're going. You can follow up as much as you need to, but I don't have much more for you here. We have to do this,
Yeah, I think relying on, as an emergency worker, relying on what is, sort of your duty, which is to, provide, care. I think that's a very reasonable approach. Now, a lot of people talk about remaining silent, and, certainly, in terms of HIPAA disclosure or not, trying not to disclose information, I think certainly that's a really, you're able to rely on that to a degree. Go ahead.
So that's something that I want to unpack a little bit too, because going back to the warrants, right? If you have an agent who has a list of names, right, and we're not allowed to disclose the patient's name, but they have you know what I mean? Like that, if they've matched that name to that address or wherever else, I guess there's a high potential to really have kind of a negative interaction between EMS and whatever agents are there. So I guess, and again, how is this something that how would you pursue that situation? Because I don't know, because usually we respond and there's, local police on scene as well. So,
Sure.
You don't want it to turn into a 2 against 1 kind of thing. And obviously diffusing a situation is always the best way to go about things, but it's a matter of, how do we handle HIPAA in the presence of a warrant that might be confusing?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, because it depends on does the person's name, I mean, is that even covered? And that's a tough question to ask. I mean, I guess I would also say, I imagine there are scenarios that EMS workers don't really know the full identity of the person that they're treating. I mean, that's another sort of
significantly
hurdle to it. Yeah.
And
so
I think that one of the best things you can say in that situation to diffuse everything, and also not to put a political spin on it. You may have personal beliefs like, hey, I may not agree with this, or you might be pro this, but we don't get to make that decision in the field. And when we're in uniform or we're treating a patient care comes first. I find that one of the easiest things for me to say is, I don't know. Go to an accident and the cop sticks his head in and goes, oh, was he drinking? I don't know. Is he on drugs? I don't know yet. He's sick.
To the hospital.
Hey, listen, I don't have enough information right now. I can't tell you definitively. You were going to have to find out later.
I actually like that. I like that perspective. Like you almost, from an EMS perspective, you kind of punt the issue to the hospital. I do think it's a very delicate space. I mean, we're talking about spaces like this is potentially a public space where, somebody's being treated, maybe in the street or outside or at the outside their house or even inside their house, but the door's open, potential sort of plain view public space. But at the same time, it's a very sensitive space. Sensitive things are happening. Medical care is being provided sometimes and probably oftentimes life-saving medical care. So the notion that ICE is identifying whoever the person is should be the priority. It probably needs to take a back seat. And I do like the idea of saying, hey, listen, again, to Dan's point, you can follow us.
The hospital's not going anywhere. Yeah, and
we're going to be in the big market box. You can't miss us.
Yeah. And Dan's right. There are plenty of times you're like, we just don't have the patient's name. And I wonder if there might be an argument to, because no one wants to kick the can down the road, right? You don't want to deliberately make it someone else's problem. But in a very unique setting like this, and Matthew, obviously you'll know, what the case law is, because I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of it after, in the past month. But given that, it might be that the hospital has more infrastructure, it has more people, it's just bigger. It might just be that it's simply too inconvenient for, that type of, interaction to happen at a hospital. And I think that's a valid point. Yeah.
Well, Ed, I guarantee you that every hospital has a risk management or a compliance officer that is either a lawyer or has a lawyer on call that can answer these questions for you. And guess what? I'm a paramedic and a retired cop. I'm not a lawyer, nor was I ever a lawyer. As a matter of fact, that was beaten into our heads pretty severely, because when you get up against these guys, sometimes you'll lose badly. I've seen people get really hammered on depositions and, in trial, because you think you know a little bit about something, but it's really Dunning-Kruger, and these guys know it more than you do. So I find in my case, the easiest thing is to say, I'm not sure. I don't know. I'd love to help you, but I can't. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, I do think ICE officers are receptive to that. It's tricky. I mean, where we see the immigration sort of case of a person who, is undocumented and whose Fourth Amendment rights have been infringed upon, sort of take a turn is when the person's nationality is disclosed. I mean, that's when we try to suppress any type of evidence towards nationality. So that's like where the person was originally is originally from, right? It always focuses on that interaction between the initial encounter with ICE and the person when they're detained by ICE. So if it's in an emergency medical situation, and the person themselves can't provide that information, then, as a paramedic, you wouldn't want to put yourself in a position where later you have an immigration attorney calling you as a witness at a bond hearing. I mean, that's right? Where it'd be like, hey, listen, I need to know what you said to them. And then there being type of a HIPAA violation. So there's a lot of moving parts to this.
And there's a lot of times where we can kind of put our own ideas or opinions, when we're talking to even whether it's law enforcement or, the EMS that we're with, family members and like that. But this is certainly one of those places where I think that in that Dunning-Kruger idea that Danny was talking about, you can think that a lot based on some information that you've heard, but there's so much that's happened in the past month or so where that's part of the reason we wanted to talk to you, Matthew, is that I'm not convinced that any one person can really absorb all of the information that's happened over the past month and really have a holistic idea of really how to handle these types of situations. So I do want to get out of here because I don't want to belabor this point too much, but I do want to give you the last word. Give us, what are your thoughts? Where do you think this is going to go? How different is our life and our world going to look in 6 months? And then whatever else you have to say about this.
Sure. It's hard to say whether right now things there's been a drastic change in how, sort of ICE officers pushing that right to privacy and acting on, really challenging what constitutes a private versus a public space. So where, over the last 4 years didn't really see ICE in, where people were working. You saw ICE showing up, occasionally to a person who'd been arrested by the police for, a second DUI or for domestic violence or for, again, different assault crimes. Mm-hmm. They would be very targeted. Now it's more targeted, but in public spaces where there's more people involved. And I think it could, I agree with you to what you're sort of, I guess, insinuating is that, this could be some sort of I kind of think there might be a little bit of bravado to this, right? So it's a new administration trying to appeal to its base.
I sincerely hope that this doesn't turn into a larger problem. And we talked about this off air. It's very frustrating to me, and Dan, I imagine to us, that we even have to have this conversation. But that's where we are.
I admit, I was kind of surprised when you reached out, and then I was like, you know what, this has probably happened. I was surprised when I had my daughter's preschool say that they'd heard that ICE agents were outside of a preschool, and then somebody said yes, ICE. So it's really challenging our perception of what, how much of this is society willing to accept, right? Like how much, from just on a societal standpoint. And I don't know if if we're gonna have 4 years of this, but I would say that there's a lot in terms of how these really sensitive spaces. And actually, there was a Maryland federal judge that today put limits on where ICE, what types of action ICE can take at or around a place of worship, right? Because it infringes upon the person's right to practice their religion. It's the same concept in terms of the right to privacy. These are like constitutional. These are really important fundamental
constitutional
rights.
Issues.
Fundamental right, absolutely. So I think relying on these very basic constitutional arguments that I have a right to privacy or my patient has a right to privacy, and also identifying the space itself. This is a very delicate space, I think would be the way to go, punting to the hospitals.
No, and I think that makes sense. I think, in our initial training, we spent a lot of time talking about HIPAA and privacy rights. And I think it's also a good time to kind of lean into these are the environments where all that matters, right? Not sharing the information you don't need to share, keeping everything private for the patient is among the best things that we can do. But Matthew Hartnett is an immigration attorney from Philadelphia. Go Birds. Thank you so much for joining us, man. Appreciate it. For the Overrun, this special episode, I'm Ed Bauter. He's Dan Schwester. We'll talk to you all next time.
See you later.